Thank you all for being here. So my name is Francisco Lara, and I am a second-year professor here in the Sociology, Criminology, and Anthropology department. I'm also a faculty affiliate of the Latin American Studies and Caribbean Studies program. And as many of you know, especially those in my class, I'm a sociologist whose primary area of study are immigration and cities, with a particular focus on the Mexican experience in the United States. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Professor Adam Goodman here to Hofstra. So before I tell you a little bit about Professor Goodman, I would be remiss not to take this opportunity to thank a few people first. First, I want to thank Athleen Collins, Carol Mallison, and Janine Rinaldi, and everyone else at the Hofstra Cultural Center for providing the funding that made this talk possible. Without their generous support, we wouldn't have Professor Goodman here. Second, I want to mention the other co-sponsors of the event, the Latin American Studies and Caribbean Studies program, the Department of Sociology, Criminology, and Anthropology, and the Department of History, and last but not least, the Department of Religion, for their additional financial and logistical support. In particular, I want to thank Professor Santiago Slabowski and Brenda Elsey for their tireless work in making this happen. Finally, I want to thank our distinguished speaker, Professor Goodman, for taking time out of his busy schedule and braving the New York City airports at this particular moment to come talk to our students here on Long Island, which is very much a site of struggle over immigration and deportation. So on that note, let me introduce Adam Goodman. Professor Goodman is Associate Professor in the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies, and also by courtesy in the Department of History at the University of Illinois, Chicago. And I am excited to have him here today because Professor Goodman is one of the foremost experts on the history of deportation. And as you will hear from him today, though it is tempting to think of our current moment of immigration policy as completely unprecedented or even exceptional, the reality is that the United States has a long history of using the exact same tactics that we are seeing on our televisions and on our phones today on immigrant communities that arrived in the past. But this finding is not what I find so compelling about his work. What has been so shocking about reading The Deportation Machine, and the reason that I now assigned this book in my immigration class, is that Professor Goodman gives us numbers where previous work has given us only compelling stories. And it is by combining the stories of people with an understanding of the sheer number of people that have been deported across history in the United States that we start to appreciate the staggering racialized and gendered scale of prior mass deportation campaigns today. But I won't spoil the story for you, right? I'll let Adam tell the story that he has so artfully written. I should also say that The Deportation Machine is an award-winning book. It was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in History and received the Prose Award in North American History from the Association of American Publishers, the Henry Adams Book Prize for the Society for History and the Federal Government, and an honorable mention for the Theodore Saluto's Book Award from the Immigration and Ethnic Story History. His work has also been featured in major journals in history and in other popular outlets. So we are very happy, we are very honored that Professor Goodman is joining us here today. So please help me in giving Professor Goodman a warm welcome to Hofstra.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you so much all for being here. Thank you for the kind invitation. Thank you to everyone who made this event possible. I'm very grateful to be here and to be in conversation with you all. And I look forward to our discussion today. A special thanks to Professor Lara, Professor Elzy, Professor Zablotsky, and I am looking forward again to our time together. I wish it weren't so timely, but here we are. What kind of nation is the United States? That's the question that begins my book. Perhaps it's a question many of you have been contemplating in the past year, or during the past decade for that matter. Many people have heard the saying the United States is a nation of immigrants. Far fewer know that US authorities have deported around 64 million people during the past century and a half, or that federal agents have expelled more people during the last century than they've allowed to remain on a permanent basis. But I'm sure that some of you have been directly affected by the Trump administration's crackdown on immigrants and on people who have acted in solidarity with them in recent months. And I'm sure that some of you have found what has happened during the past year surprising or shocking, difficult to wrap your head around, or maybe even difficult to stomach. Immigration raids, detentions, deportations, family separations, unidentified masked agents of the state kidnapping people and killing citizens and non-citizens in the streets. These are not easy or uplifting topics to contemplate or confront, but they are some of the most pressing political and social issues of our time, and they demand our attention. So I feel fortunate to have the opportunity to discuss them with you today. There's also something else I want to discuss, something that often gets lost amid the never-ending doom scrolling that the algorithm feeds us. The fact that people have fought against the deportation machine for as long as it has existed. And not just immigrants and non-citizens, as we've seen recently in Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Minneapolis, and many other places across the nation. After Donald Trump was first elected in 2016, writer and photographer Teju Cole and photographer Fazal Sheikh collaborated on a photo book exploring the stories of displaced people in the 21st century. In it, they pose a series of essential questions. Who is the stranger? Who is my neighbor? Who is kin? Who counts as my family? Who or what is a citizen? How might we be able to move from a conversation about rights to one about the mutual responsibilities that people bear toward each other, regardless of their race, religion, gender, or nationality? Cole and Sheikh help us see that immigration, asylum, and refuge are issues that affect us all, issues that all of us should care about. Although my talk is titled Fighting the Deportation Machine, perhaps dismantling is more apt in the sense that it has two meanings: to break the machine into its individual parts and to destroy the machine. Understanding the first is essential to attempting the second. That is, anyone who hopes to fight against inhumane immigration policies must first understand how the deportation machine works. So with that in mind, my talk today will proceed in two parts. First, understanding the machine, then fighting the machine. So I'd like to briefly share some of the key takeaways from more than a decade and a half of thinking, research, reading, and writing about the history of immigration and deportation. Some key points that will frame our conversation today, and perhaps we can revisit later. But one thing that I think not a lot of people realize is that this is a long and bipartisan history. This is not a history that starts in 2016 with the election of Donald Trump. This is, in fact, a history that dates back to the mid to late 19th century. It's a history in which Democrats and Republicans alike have overseen punitive immigration policies that have had detrimental effects for citizens and non-citizens. You know, the idea for my book first came to me during Barack Obama's first presidency, in fact. Trying to make sense of how someone who preached hope and change coming into the White House could then turn around and apprehend and deport hundreds of thousands of people each year. This photograph may bring to mind many things that have been in the news recently. It's in fact a dozen years old, from 2014, during the second Obama administration. Family separation, the detention of children, that was something that was happening then, something that was happening prior So this is not a history that starts with Donald Trump. And it's a history in which many different people in positions of power have exercised and in many cases abused that power to force, coerce, and scare people out of the country, as well as to exert control over those who remain. I define the deportation machine as the laws, policies, means, and strategies that together facilitate mass expulsion, as well as enable authorities to exercise control over those who are in the country. There have been many different drivers to the machine, things propelling it forward over time, but it's really a mix of bureaucratic, capitalist, and racist imperatives. In different points in time, certain factors coming to the fore. But the machine itself has led to the tremendous growth of state power. It's led to a consistent and exploitable migrant labor supply in the United States, and it's also led to heightened xenophobia and to questions of belonging, questions of who's deserving and who's not, questions of who's an American and who's not. The second point I want to emphasize is that deportation without due process has long been the American way. I think there's an idea that much of what we're seeing today or in the past year as a stark break from the past. The reality is that very few people have had an opportunity to have their day in court, so to speak. If I say deportation, what does the process look like? You might describe a scene in which an immigrant has their day in front of a judge who's able to hear the merits of their case and decide whether or not they're able to stay in the country. That, in fact, is not how the vast majority, 85 to 90% of people throughout US history have been removed from the country. There are different mechanisms of expulsion, which I trace over the course of 150 years. And the reality is that most people have left through coercive, fast-track expulsions. An administrative deportation, euphemistically called voluntary departure, comprises around 85% of those expelled. Voluntary departures play a similar role in the immigration enforcement system that plea bargains play in the criminal justice system. When you think about it, it's the best of all the really bad options facing immigrants who have been apprehended. But another important mechanism that I document over the course of US history, and which I think most of you are probably familiar with today, are fear campaigns, immigration raids, the strategic use of the media, and threats of violence in hopes of getting people to self-deport or to make their lives so miserable that they decide to get up and leave on their own. So this is really the history of deportation. It's not one in which people have their day in court. It's not one in which people have the merits of their cases heard. It's one in which people, like you see in this photo, Mexican migrants rounded up en masse in the middle of the 1950s, were taken through expedited means back to Mexico and oftentimes separated from their families. A third thing I want to emphasize here, the human costs. The stakes of this story. The deportation machine has had extraordinary human costs, for so many. And again, I emphasize both non-citizens, permanent residents, and citizens alike. These costs have been physical, psychological, and material. And there have been two things in particular that throughout US history have driven the business of deportation. That's profits and punishment. And the toxic combination of those two and the perverse economic incentives involved have led to extraordinary suffering, and I think led to conditions in which many would find untenable, unacceptable, unimaginable. The photo you see here is of a boat ironically titled Emancipación, Emancipation, which was owned by a private Mexican shipping company that deported tens of thousands of people across the Gulf of Mexico in the middle of the 1950s, in which they took bananas from the Mexican state of Tabasco to places like Alabama and Texas, and picked up deportees on the return trip and holding them in the same spaces that they used for the fruit. This is just one example, but it's a long history in which perverse economic incentives, as I mentioned, today we could think of private prison companies and the increasing role that they've had, have led to a dependence on certain motives and motivations that I think are not in the best interests of certainly the individuals most affected, the migrants themselves, but the nation as well. Punishment, though, has served a particular purpose. And in fact, immigration officials throughout US history have strategically used deportation as a means of punishment in hopes of discouraging people from re-entering the country. There's a tactic that emerged in the 1990s called prevention through deterrence. If you can deter people from coming back, it's going to be a lot easier, a lot cheaper to keep them out of the country. This is, in fact, how the deportation machine has operated for much of US history. It's turned deportation into a business, and state policies have turned human beings into deportable commodities. This particular photograph I just wanted to pause on briefly to show you, which perhaps more than any other in this particular part of the book that I document has really haunted me in a way. If you see it to the right there, there's a young boy, perhaps a teenager, looking up through the slats of the hull of the Emancipación or the Mercurio, different boats used in these operations. But I think whenever we're thinking about immigration, about deportation, about the stories that we see in the news, remembering the human stakes, remembering those most affected, remembering who's involved, and whose lives are really at stake in many cases, is something that should never be far from our minds. The last thing that I wanted to mention here in terms of takeaways from this long history that I've documented is that deportation has played a constitutive role, and immigration enforcement efforts have played a constitutive role in determining ideas and helping to create ideas of belonging, of citizenship, deservingness, as I mentioned, who's an American and who's not. It very much matters that throughout US history, around 90% of all people apprehended and deported have been Mexican. When we come to think of the stereotypes that emerge and that are reinforced by politicians and through the media, that Mexicans or Latinos, more broadly, are prototypical, quote-unquote, illegal immigrants. That in part is a result of the disproportionate targeting of them by immigration enforcement officials. It has nothing to do with the people themselves. It's these practices that are helping to create these ideas. And that is something that we should be mindful of. So what I'd like to do now, and I'd be happy to talk in more depth about any of these particular points that I highlighted at the beginning. But what I'd like to do now is transition a bit and move to some stories of folks. Not stories of how bad everything is, but stories of how people have navigated their way through seemingly impossible circumstances. How people in the past have perhaps navigated their way through situations that might be similar in some general sense to what we are facing today. The first story is Us Versus Them, the saga of the Lozoya family. When Rodolfo Lozoya left Chicago for Mexico in January 1957 to visit his mother, who had just had a heart attack, he probably did not think that he would face threat of permanent separation from his family. Lozoya, 48 years old at the time, was originally from the Mexican state of Durango and had lived in the United States for nearly 3 decades. He was a steelworker and a trade union activist who had also served in the US Air Force during the Second World War. Immigration officials had considered deporting him during the war, but decided to wait until he was discharged. For reasons unknown, they never did, and in 1950, Lozoya married Consuelo Villanueva. She had 3 children from a former marriage, and in the years ahead, the couple would have 4 more kids of their own. Consuelo and their 7 children were all US citizens. After the war, growing tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union led authorities to shift their energies and resources to excluding and deporting suspected communists. While the House Un-American Activities Committee's high-profile public hearings of prominent Hollywood actors received much attention, officials also increasingly targeted people like Lozoya, ordinary people, who authorities had classified as a security threat under a repressive immigration act called the McCarran-Walter Act of 1952. Although immigration officials never pursued Lozoya's deportation, they realized there might be another way to achieve their goal of purging him from the country, when he informed them that he would be visiting his ailing mother in Ciudad Juarez, right along the border on the other side from El Paso. INS officials in Chicago sent a profile and a physical description of Lozoya, along with details about his travel plans, learned through an informant, to their counterparts in El Paso, who then posted a lookout on the bridge. When Lozoya showed up to purchase a return train ticket, agents were waiting for him. A few days after authorities turned away Rodolfo Lozoya and served him with an exclusion order, his wife Consuelo wrote to the acting chief of the INS in El Paso, imploring him to allow her husband to re-enter the United States. This was the exclusion order that he received upon presenting himself at the border. Consuelo appended a PS at the end of the letter, stating that she and her 7 children were all U.S. citizens, perhaps thinking that that would expedite his case or curry some favor with the immigration official. And you can see here, perhaps at the bottom, that when I requested this information through the Freedom of Information Act from the federal government, the Department of Homeland Security censored the part about Consuelo's PS, omitting the line where she states that she was a U.S. citizen, which you can clearly infer from what was left uncensored, the "and" sign, "so are my children," all from Chicago, Illinois. Soon, the Midwest Committee for the Protection of the Foreign-Born, a leading immigrant rights organization, and an offshoot of a national Popular Front organization, came to Lozoya's defense. The Midwest Committee started organizing on the family's behalf within days of Rodolfo's exclusion at El Paso. The group held fundraisers, helped find and pay for legal representation, formed a committee to reunite the Lozoya family, and used the media to publicize the case. They zeroed in on family separation as the best strategy to win public support for Lozoya. The organization knew his case was a long shot, legally speaking, and less people generally are aroused to the injustice involved, they said, or to the attack on the pocketbooks of taxpayers. So they put out a press release that said, "A woman and 7 children have been forced onto the relief rolls in this city because their breadwinner is barred from re-entering the United States." The family and the group spoke out against the draconian and arbitrary nature of the McCarran-Walter Act. Consuelo, his wife, wrote an open letter to Attorney General Herbert Brownell, urging him to put an end to such fascist laws, she wrote, and to return my husband to his family where he belongs. The Midwest Committee argued that the legislation not only denied to foreign-born Americans their fundamental rights under the Constitution, but directly and indirectly affected the whole American people. Lozoya himself went even further. It is known that in a democratic republic like the United States, there is always and there should be some members of such families that do not agree with the majority, and their opinion of minorities should be respected by the majority. In democracy, there is and there should always be tolerance and respect in the family that composes it. But if this is eliminated by force on the minority without discussion, then this is no democracy. Such laws, he added, are for nations with dictators. The archival trail of the Lozoya case runs dry in late 1958, nearly 2 years into their saga, or perhaps you might consider it the family's nightmare. Though much remains unknown about Rodolfo Lozoya, we know that at some point he re-entered the country. And the family's story illuminates much about the hypocrisy and human costs of Cold War immigration laws, many of them documented in detail by letters between Rodolfo and Consuelo, a few of which you can see here, these handwritten letters from the archive from the Chicago History Museum. But the case also provides insights into the strategies that people adopted to fight against these laws, many of which remain relevant today. US officials welcomed Lozoya as a worker and as a soldier, but they targeted him for deportation and exclusion because of his political beliefs, despite his decades-long ties and contributions to the country. The Allies' defeat of Nazism and fascism may have allowed them to protect the fundamental freedoms celebrated in post-war America, but these essential civil liberties and rights never extended to people like Rodolfo Lozoya, or in turn, to the 8 US citizens and his family. You can see here Consuelo with their children. To fully grasp the impact of restrictive immigration policies, then or now, we must move beyond any one individual caught in the crosshairs and instead examine the intertwined lives of husbands and wives, parents and children, citizens and non-citizens. As Martin Luther King Jr. wrote in his famous letter from a Birmingham jail just 6 years after authorities separated the Lozoya family, we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. Despite what politicians may claim or what they may want us to believe, we can't separate the so-called us from the so-called them. It's only us. We're in this together. The second story is playing defense and offense. A diverse coalition fights the machine and wins. And this is a story I document in my book. If I'm going to go through very quickly, but if you're interested, you can read more there. So here we go, playing defense and offense. Javier Garcia Bautista had not been working for long on Wednesday, May 17th, 1978, when someone in the carpentry department of the Sabika Shoe Company of California, located in suburban Los Angeles, yelled out, "The migre is here." Early that morning, after a planning meeting in their downtown office, in which they put together documents like this, with surveillance photographs and plans of factories, the floor plans of different factories, 40 immigration investigators piled into at least 8 vans and 1 bus and headed east to their target. They arrived a little before 8 a.m., and after a company executive gave them permission to conduct a so-called survey, the agents blocked off all the exits to the factory, the front door leading out to the employee parking lot, the north-facing windows, and the loading dock near the gate around back. With the building secured, teams of 3 to 4 investigators entered the factory and fanned out. Hoping to avoid detection, the 22-year-old Garcia Bautista tucked himself out of sight. As he hid, the agents circulated throughout the massive 62,500 square foot plant, indiscriminately questioning the workers, asking them if they had papers. They arrested men and women, taking down their information, handcuffing some, pushing others. Soon after the raid started, 2 agents from Supervisor J.L. O'Brien's crew approached 17-year-old Rosa Melchor Lopez at her workstation. When she didn't respond to their inquiry about whether she had papers, they took a hold of her arms, one on either side of the 5'2" woman. Once outside the factory, an investigator searched Melchor Lopez's bag and then shoved her onto one of the immigration buses, which was already packed with her coworkers. At 10:05, as the operation wound down, plainclothes investigator Raleigh Clark shined his flashlight into a container. "I see a body here," he called out, at which point he and another agent pulled Javier Garcia Bautista from his hiding place, handcuffed him, and led him out to the waiting vehicles. The INS investigators returned to downtown Los Angeles that morning with 119 shoe factory workers in their custody, by mid-afternoon, they had coerced most of the people into signing voluntary departure forms. And by 5 p.m., no more than 9 hours after the raid had started, half of the workers were in buses on their way to San Isidro, where they'd be deported to Mexico. But the buses never made it to Mexico that day. What neither the immigration officials nor the Sabica employees knew at that time was that as agents loaded detainees onto the buses, a coalition of immigrants, labor organizers, and lawyers had convinced a federal judge to sign a temporary restraining order, stopping the workers' deportation. Nor could they have imagined that in the days, weeks, and months, and years ahead, that this case would provide a blueprint for how to bring the seemingly unstoppable deportation machine to a grinding halt. Part of the growing resistance at this time came out of the civil rights movement and the Chicano movement in the late 1960s and early 1970s. This was a growing resistance that was happening alongside an increase in an uptick in apprehensions and deportations. The mid to late 1970s is what I refer to as the dawn of the age of mass expulsion. This was a time in which the possibility of being apprehended and deported became an everyday reality for many people across the country. And this was also a time in which I think we can see the beginnings of what we'd recognize as the contemporary or modern immigrant rights movement. People spoke out. People took to the streets and the courts to protest against policies that targeted families and longstanding community members. They also organized Know Your Rights trainings, similar to what's happening today and in the recent past, as well as public education campaigns. Knowledge of the deportation machine was key. The workers knew, in this case, that the machine depended on high volumes of voluntary departures, which is why their decision to challenge their removal posed a serious threat to the Immigration Service. As a Wall Street Journal editorial noted at the time, immigration officials' great nightmare was that some part of the 1 million people a year would suddenly stop agreeing to voluntary departure, as some of these workers at this suburban LA shoe factory did. Now, these shoe factory workers and their allies blended a defensive and offensive strategy, which I think is really important to keep in mind, both at the time but also today. On the one hand, in the immediate aftermath of the raid, of the people facing deportation, those who mobilized did so to defend people facing immediate expulsion. That was of the essence. Defending people from deportation was the priority for understandable reasons. It mattered a lot that this particular factory was organized. You know, there was a union organizing campaign that had been happening in the lead up to this raid, perhaps connected to the reason why the raid happened. Also, the fact that there was a rapid response network essentially in place allowed one of the labor organizers who was out pamphleting in front of the factory that day to notify the immigration lawyers that the Immigration Service had showed up. And that's what led to the temporary restraining order. But at the same time, the lawyers and workers embarked on what ended up being a 14-year class action lawsuit, a lawsuit that didn't end until 1992, and that essentially guaranteed to provide Miranda-style rights to apprehended undocumented people. This historic nationwide settlement affected more than 1 million people every year, but it had started with just over 60 undocumented workers who had fought against their expulsion and stood up for their rights and belonging. This case changed forever those involved, including the 31 individuals who had their deportation stayed, were able to remain in the country. And the more cases that the team won, the more empowered the workers, lawyers, and organizers felt. As one of the lawyers told me when I interviewed him, it was hard to describe the headiness, as he put it, that people felt that they had defeated the government at its own game. The key, he continued, was the workers' resolve stamina, and insistence on asserting their constitutional rights. You didn't have to be a smart lawyer to come up with the strategies, he said. You had to be a courageous worker to execute them. And we didn't lose because the workers were the strength of this. After the raids, writing in the Los Angeles Times, one of the lawyers involved, along with a co-author, pointed out that when this case first arose, no one had ever heard of a suspected, quote-unquote, illegal alien arrested in a factory raid winning a deportation hearing. But history has a way of surprising the complacent, which is a nice turn of phrase, I think. It's oftentimes true. History has a way of surprising the complacent. In this case, by attacking the INS's near-exclusive reliance on coercive voluntary departures and immigration raids meant to instill widespread fear, a small coalition of undocumented immigrant workers and their allies had figured out a way to begin to dismantle the deportation machine, revealing that it was anything but invincible. The third short story that I'd like to share with you today is titled Inside Outside, Bottom Up, Top Down, Joe Moakley and the Central American Solidarity Movement. John Joseph Moakley was an unlikely champion for Salvadoran refugees. Born in 1927 to an Irish-American father and an Italian-American mother, he's the oldest of three brothers. He grew up in an apartment over a hardware store in the South Boston projects. The family lived just down the block from the Bulgers, including sons William, or Billy, the future president of the Massachusetts Senate, and James Joseph, or Whitey, the future gangster and FBI informant. Moakley trained to be a sheet metal worker in high school, but dropped out at age 15 and forged papers so that he could enlist in the Navy and serve in World War II. After the war, he returned to school, then became involved in local and state politics, earning a law degree from Suffolk University at night. He won a seat in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1973 and represented Massachusetts' 9th District for the next 28 years. Eventually, he rose to become chair of the House Rules Committee, an important moment for him and for this particular story, which I'll return to in a little bit. Moakley was, in his own words, strictly a bread and butter Democrat domestic type. A foreign affair to me, this congressman from Southie liked to quip, was going to East Boston and getting an Italian sandwich. Moakley liked to tell a story from his childhood of driving around the neighborhood with his father and coming across a scuffle between two kids, one much larger than the other. His father stopped the car and told young Joe to get out and intervene on behalf of the smaller child. He did, and beat up the bigger kid, foreshadowing his days as a light heavyweight boxer known as the Boston Bull, pictured here at left. Moakley would later credit this experience as contributing to a lifelong hatred of bullies, a hatred that, half a century later, extended to Salvadoran government authorities and to their backers in the United States. The United States played a key role, a central role, in the Salvadoran Civil War, which, from October 1979 to January 1992, left 75,000 people dead and forced more than 1 million to flee. The nation lost 25% of its population in 12 years. During the armed conflict, the administrations of Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush sent $6 billion to the Salvadoran government. A Truth and Reconciliation Commission later found the Salvadoran military and aligned forces responsible for repeated human rights violations, and 80% of all those killed, the majority civilians. Death squads disappeared people, police and military tortured rebels and anyone suspected of being a rebel or even a rebel sympathizer. US-trained Salvadoran soldiers slaughtered entire towns, leaving behind piles of men, women, and children, and piles of shell casings manufactured in Missouri. None of this None of this outweighed U.S. officials' obsession with staunching the spread of communism in their backyard during the waning years of the Cold War. U.S. aid continued unabated, with each infusion of congressional funding emboldening Salvadoran authorities and inflating their sense of unchecked power. Moakley's upbringing in a working-class Catholic family from South Boston helps explain, at least in part, why he spoke out about El Salvador and why he became involved. By the mid-1970s, the Salvadoran government had come to view Catholic clergy as subversives who were aligned with the poor, and later with the guerrillas. Be a patriot, kill a priest, was a popular slogan on the Salvadoran right. The horrific killings of Archbishop Oscar Romero, pictured here at left, and 4 U.S. churchwomen, Ida Ford, Maura Clark, and Dorothy Kazel, and lay missionary Jean Donovan in the year 1980 shocked Moakley, who came from a place where people treated clergy with reverence. Another factor was Moakley's brand of retail politics. This played a critical role in how he ended up becoming an unsuspecting leading figure in the Central American Solidarity movement. Here he is pictured in front of his Winnebago, which he used to drive around his district, which I thought was apocryphal. It couldn't have been true until I found the photo and realized that it was. He'd make the rounds in this Winnebago each year. And in late 1982 and early 1983, a local solidarity organization in the Boston area known as the Jamaica Plain Committee on Central America pushed the congressman to take a stronger stand on protecting Salvadoran refugees through what was known as extended voluntary departure. This was a temporary measure that would prevent Salvadorans from being deported and potentially deported back to their death as the Civil War was still going on. The United States' unwavering support of the Salvadoran government also resulted in blanket denials of asylum applications. The logic being, how could U.S. authorities grant asylum to someone seeking refuge from a government backed by the United States? Salvadorans weren't bona fide refugees, the Reagan administration insisted. They were economic migrants. Fewer than 3% of Salvadorans received asylum during the 1980s, which you can see here in this chart. The percentage of approval rates for asylum applications more or less maps onto the political orientation of the country and whether or not they were communist, and you can kind of see the vast discrepancies. So taking up these issues made sense for Moakley, the bread and butter congressman from Southeast, since it meant helping people in his district who lived in fear and under threat of expulsion. During 4 consecutive congressional sessions in the 1980s, Moakley co-sponsored bills to temporarily protect Salvadorans from deportation, and in turn, political violence and civil unrest in El Salvador. Time after time, the bills failed. But in 1989, after 7 years of pushing, Moakley became chairman of the House Rules Committee, and this ended up making all the difference. In 1990, politicians from both parties met in session to try to hammer out a final version of an immigration bill that included a version of extended voluntary departure, which is now known as temporary protected status. Influential senators from both parties opposed the provision. They were against it. They put their foot down. But Moakley insisted. And ultimately, his colleagues knew that, given his role as chairman of the House Rules Committee, he had the power to kill the bill, though some questioned whether he actually would. The senators involved called a recess and conferred with President George H.W. Bush. When they returned from the recess, they agreed to offer Salvadorans temporary protected status for a period of 18 months. The provision became law when President Bush signed the Immigration Act of 1990. Moakley had played hardball and won. Now, TPS which is something you might be familiar with if you've been following the news recently, since it's always on the chopping block and is a threat of disappearing. It was, and it is, an imperfect solution. But it was a major victory nonetheless for both Salvadorans in the United States and all who fought to protect them from the uncertain fates that awaited them if they were deported. And we shouldn't take its existence or the protections it provided, however limited they might be, for granted. Now, TPS is a product of an inside-outside strategy. It's also a product of sustained struggle by an individual, Joe Moakley, and sustained struggle by a coalition of people that push him to act and push him to take up this position in the first place. As one of the solidarity activists involved said, you needed a person on the inside to really do the work and have the commitment. And you also needed the pressure from the outside to give them the excuse to move forward with it. The story of TPS's creation teaches us about both the power of ordinary people and the importance of powerful people to effect political change. Both mattered, then as now. So as we wind down today, first I want to recap very briefly, I think, some of the lessons that I've learned during the last decade and a half and researching, writing, and thinking about immigration history and policy. To fight against the deportation machine, and I think these are lessons that come out of the stories that I've shared with you today. To fight against the deportation machine, we must certainly have a clear understanding of how it works. We have to be able to identify its weak spots and apply pressure to them. That's going to change over time. What worked in the past isn't necessarily what's going to work now. So we need careful analysis. We need creative strategies and also innovative solutions. We have to reject the false binary between the so-called us and them. Any kind of effective strategy is going to be based on playing both defense and also thinking proactively and playing offense. Organizing broad coalitions that push politicians to stake out new ground on immigration is going to be essential as well. As I mentioned in the very beginning, the first slide is that this is a bipartisan history. At the same time, I don't want you to leave today thinking that both parties are the same. They certainly aren't. You know, for much of U.S. history, Democrats and Republicans more or less shared a similar vision with some differences around the edges when it came to immigration. That's certainly not true today. Democrats, for their part, have shown to be more susceptible to pressure from below, pressure from social movements. Yet at the same time, they haven't staked out any new ground on their own, really. They haven't done too much to differentiate themselves. Perhaps we're seeing that change now. I'm holding my breath. We'll see what happens. Historians don't usually predict the future. But I think that's something that we need to wait and see. What I certainly do think the history shows is that we need new, bold politicians willing to take potentially controversial stances that are based in not only their political beliefs, but also moral and ethical beliefs. We need people to lead on immigration, as the current administration has, albeit with different goals and ends in mind. And another lesson, I think, is that certainly all of the above that I mentioned depend on solidarity and sustained struggle. That's what history shows. That's when breakthroughs can potentially happen. So with that said, let's end today where we began, and thinking about the present. And I imagine some of you are wondering whether the crackdown on immigration will ever end. The current administration's constant scapegoating and vilification of immigrants makes it difficult to imagine that things will change anytime soon. You know, this is, no doubt, in many ways, a time of darkness. But it's also a time of possibility. Today, an unprecedented number of immigrants and those acting in solidarity with them have mobilized. Whether they can dismantle the deportation machine remains to be seen, but our mutual responsibilities to one another requires us to act until our nation's policies no longer prioritize punishment and profits over people's well-being. Currently, there's little political will among Democrat and Republican elected officials to stake out new ground. But that doesn't mean that nothing can be done. As Rosana Perez, a Salvadoran refugee, organizer, and intellectual, told me during a recent conversation, to truly change the course of history takes time. And the stories I've shared today remind us, especially now, in a moment that I think many would consider a moment of tremendous pessimism, that nothing is inevitable. Nothing is inevitable, and that a different world is possible, as long as we're willing to work for it and to fight to make it a reality. Just as past laws and policies built the deportation machine, future laws and policies could dismantle it. History shows that policymakers usually don't act unless pushed. So I leave you today with the words of the late, great Haywood Burns, the lawyer, legal scholar, and champion of justice. He said, "There are those who say that our triumph is inevitable, that the forces of history are on our side, and that they will vindicate us. There are those who say that we will not win, that we are Don Quixotes tilting at windmills, that we are Sisyphus, interminably pushing that rock up the hill, only to have it roll back down again. As for me, I don't know. But it seems to me that principled people have no choice but to struggle. I do believe we can win if we just keep pushing that rock." So I leave you with that. Keep pushing that rock. Thank you.
So at this point, we're open to take questions from students. So if you have questions, I encourage you to line up, either on this mic over here or on that mic over there.
While you're formulating a question or two, and I'd be happy to talk about anything and answer anything, I just wanted to mention this photo, which also began and ended the talk. This is a photo of college students like yourself, who are from the University of Illinois Chicago, where I teach, in 2009, 2010, who started what became known as the undocumented and unafraid movement. This is a very different moment in time, a moment when coming out about your immigration status and being undocumented actually provided some protection in the Obama administration years. And this was something that became a yearly tradition. On March 10th each year, college students across the country would come out as undocumented and unafraid, an incredibly empowering experience for many, but also one that led to change, to policy change. This was an example I had to cut from the talk since we didn't have limited time today. But the program some of you may be familiar with called DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, really is a product of the sustained struggle of young people like yourselves who pushed the Obama administration to act. They failed on the one hand to get Congress to pass the DREAM Act, which would have provided more permanent protections, but they succeeded in pushing the Obama administration to implement DACA, which is not unlike TPS, or temporary protected status, that I talked about, and that millions of people, or hundreds of thousands of people at least, have benefited from. So I just wanted to mention that since this particular photo appeared twice. But that also speaks to another truth, and that's that oftentimes it's young people who are in the front lines of pushing for and leading these changes.
Hi, I'm Nico.
Hi, Nico.
Just a question I had was, what can we do in our everyday lives that can affect change on such a large issue?
Great question. I'm curious to hear what other people think. Maybe some of you are actually already doing some of this work. But something that comes to mind, for me at least, is to really start at home, kind of locally, whether that means on campus or in your neighborhood, wherever it is that you might be from. Chances are that people have already been organizing around the issue of immigration. There might be groups that exist currently that you could become involved in or contribute to in some way. Certainly another thing was to educate yourself and to learn more about this particular topic. And as I hope the story I told today of Joe Moakley makes clear, it matters who our elected officials are. So, thinking more broadly about who's representing us at the local, state, and national level. Those are all things that I think matter a great deal, and each person might have a different approach or different set of interests that would lead them to get involved with one or more of those.
Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Jake.
Hi, Jake.
So I think one of the biggest issues is that ICE agents and immigration is often guarding the outside of courthouses, which causes immigrants who want to change their documentation to be in almost a catch-22 moment where they can either go to the courthouse, change their documentation, and risk being detained, or they don't change their documentation and continue being at risk. So for that aspect of fighting the deportation machine, what do you suggest the best course of action for that is?
That's a very difficult question, and one that I don't think I'm in the position to tell people what to do. And I think ultimately people have to make decisions for themselves and their families about what feels right and what seems right. But you're pointing to something really essential to understand, and that's that the current administration has used the entirety of the immigration bureaucracy, which historically has been divided into kind of a service wing that would provide people with opportunities to get support or to become permanent residents or to qualify for asylum or refugee status or to become citizens for that matter, on the one hand, and the enforcement wing on the other hand. Today they're really one and the same in many senses, being used for enforcement efforts, as you point out. So it's put people in an impossible situation, as you noted. And I think that's incredibly concerning. I think that people are facing really difficult decisions. And I think that ultimately it speaks to something else that's important, and that's that the really only way around this in some sense is to limit people's interaction with the immigration bureaucracy itself. And that points to some kind of legislative solution that would need to occur, although that doesn't seem to be on the horizon anytime soon. So I appreciate you bringing it up because it's an important observation and something that hasn't always been the case. Previously, anyone could walk into an immigration court. You could observe the proceedings, see what was happening. That's not the case today either. So a lot has changed, and I think we've learned a lot about just how much power the executive branch has over immigration and immigration enforcement. So each person would have to make their decision based on a set of circumstances that they consider along with their loved ones.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for coming today. I just wanted to ask, so you talked a lot about the importance of sustained struggle in terms of making change, which I think is really admirable. But over the course of your research, have you noted any shorter term strategies that have also been effective for protecting people and creating change?
Good question. Some of them, as the case of the shoe factory workers brings to mind at least, depended on people being organized to begin with. Already being organized before bad things happen matters a great deal when you need to jump into action immediately to stop someone from being deported that very same day, as in the case of those workers. If people weren't organized at that shoe factory, those workers would have been back in Mexico, as so many others found themselves. And so that's certainly something. I think the organizing on the local level is essential to bring about those changes, whether it's short-term or long-term. But I just think there's something really important about having a long-term strategy and also recognizing that you don't necessarily know when those transformative breakthroughs are going to happen. So it's incumbent upon people to kind of keep the pressure up, which is a difficult task and a big ask because you don't know if anything will ever happen or what will happen. But I think what we do know is that rarely do things happen when people are just invested for a short period of time. I don't know, does anything come to mind in your own thinking about this in terms of short term?
Well, actually, just what the student before me had mentioned in terms of courthouses and stuff, some activist organizations that I'm a part of organize sit-ins at courthouses to shut the whole thing down to prevent anybody from going in and out, including both court officials, but also immigrants who were called to court that day, basically preventing any potential deportations. I was just curious if you additional tactics you noted historically that might have been like that. But I think you kind of answered that already.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. You know, something that happened around the same time that this photo is from, and really throughout the 2010s, was that people engaged in, you know, what I would describe, I guess, as brave and bold acts of civil disobedience, you know, putting themselves at risk for arrest and potentially for deportation as well. So there are a lot of cases in which, you know, people blocked buses that were set to go to O'Hare Airport in Chicago from a detention facility in the area, and physically stop people from being deported by putting them, you know, their well-being, their physical well-being, and their freedom on the line. Today, I don't think that would be an effective strategy. You know, that was at a particular moment in time. And that's where it goes back to the point, I think, about really having a clear analysis of like where the weak points are at any one moment in time, and recognizing they're going to change. They're not going to necessarily be consistent across time. And so for me, at least, I feel like there's just a lot of question marks right now about what are the most effective strategies. And people at the very local level, as you're describing, are reacting in real time and also formulating new responses in real time and seeing what happens. But I think it's difficult to say or to generalize. I would mention. So this moment in time, I think people like yourselves and others who are, you know, involved in that type of organizing, you know, really have, you know, a better sense of the local conditions and what's working in a particular place that may or may not be applicable elsewhere or at another point in time.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, thank you again for your presentation. I had a quick question about voluntary departure specifically.
Yes.
That was kind of one of the things I was most surprised to learn about when I read your book. I just wanted to know if today, right now in this moment, if you think that we're still seeing primarily voluntary departures or government coercion and incentives to depart and leave the country, or if you think that we're seeing more formal deportations than we've seen in the past.
Yeah, we have seen an uptick in formal deportations during the past probably 12, 15 years since the Obama administration moving forward. The difference now is that formal deportations, which you would think might provide some kind of due process that the expedited, streamlined expulsions don't, they've come to resemble the expedited, streamlined expulsions in how fast they are, you know, how few rights people have to challenge their expulsion. And, you know, that's something that we've certainly seen. But there's still people being coerced and pressured into signing voluntary departure forms. There's also new mechanisms that emerge. We got to think, you know, during the end of the first Trump administration, in the early days of the pandemic, there was what became known as Title 42 expulsions. And there's many different ways. The baseline kind of connecting them all is that expedited expulsions have always been how the deportation machine is operated, and in fact, the system depends on that, with one caveat. Anyone who's been following the news in the past year knows that there's an incredible infusion of funding, an unprecedented record amount of funding put into immigration enforcement. We don't know what that's going to mean for immigration enforcement policies and for the experiences of people moving forward. And we've already seen that the immigration detention population has ballooned to around 70,000 people. It was around 14 or 15,000 just 5 or 6 years ago. So there's a lot changing right now, a lot that we're unsure of. But it does feel like we're at a crucial turning point in which I think the agency and the bureaucracy is still going to try to do as much as it can, as cheaply as possible. But that also might mean, you know, being able to pull more people into these immigration enforcement operations than they would have otherwise been able to affect.
Thank you.
Thanks for the question.
Thank you so much. Your last comment made me think about the question of profit that you highlight in your lecture, and I wonder if you could elaborate a little bit on that aspect, like who's benefiting from this influx of money.
That's a great question. You know, certainly a lot of private companies that provide services, whether those are transportation services, you know, historically there have been private, you know, airlines, bus companies, you know, trains, boats, shipping companies, et cetera. And that we've certainly seen that, but also people that provide food services and concessions and detention centers, let alone the private detention companies themselves, and those who invested in them, prior to the first or second time Trump was elected. I mean, if you do you look historically at like the stock price of the Geo Group or Core Civic, the two main private detention companies, it would have been a smart financial decision to pour a lot of money into them right before the 2016 or 2024 election. So there's many people on many levels that are profiting, and I think the other thing that I should mention is that it's not so simple either. It's not just people looking to make extraordinary wealth, although there certainly is that. It's local communities and areas that have experienced incredible depopulation, disinvestment, that need jobs. And so a lot of these detention facilities pop up in communities with high unemployment, and people need jobs. And those detention companies provide opportunities for people to work in immigration enforcement, just like they would at a local jail or facility. And once those facilities are established, it's very difficult to get rid of them. There's a lot of incentive at the local level for people to want to keep them around. And I think that the bureaucratic and institutional inertia is an important factor here. And I'm concerned, I would say, about the fact that it's not necessarily easy to build and expand the deportation machine, but I do think it may be even more difficult to dismantle it once some of these systems are put in place.
Hello, Mr. Goodman. Thank you for coming.
Hi, thanks.
So I heard you mention Father Romero. We learned about him in Professor Slobodowski's class. And I'm wondering your take on your thoughts on the powers that be mobilizing religion to keep people like Father Romero's story of keeping faith and oppression unheard by making the oppressed believe God's interests are against their own. I almost take it as the quote you used, "Be a patriot, kill a priest," is used by the elite to keep faith dead in the oppressed.
So could you say a little more? I appreciate this question. I think it's a really important point. Could you say a little more about kind of what you're thinking of?
Yeah, so in Professor Slobodowski's class, we're currently learning about liberation theology. And my thoughts are, do you believe instead of the quote you using, remind me of the lawyer's name you used at the end of your speech?
Hayward Burns.
Hayward Burns. Instead of to keep pushing, do you believe that possibly instead of an alternative to pushing, because as college students it's difficult to make you feel like your voice or you can actually yourself commit change. But do you think togetherness and I was more wondering your take on government using religion to keep the oppressed faithless?
So it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think it depends on kind of your perspective and whose position you're viewing the question from, because there's so many people that are spiritual, are religious, and find great strength in that, and find great inspiration in that. And in fact, there's a lot of people today that I think are arguing that if any change is going to happen, religious institutions are going to play a key role in bringing it about. In part because they have people organized, in part because I think they're speaking to questions beyond politics, beyond profit motives, perhaps. Although it's not to say it's devoid of politics. The church itself, and some of the tensions and debates that I think you're pointing to, actually come from that very point. That different people within the church, certainly in the 1980s, in Central America, saw politics and religion as being inseparable, and saw their work as clergy being inseparable, from helping the poor and helping the Christian-based communities that emerge in different countries that espouse liberation theology as really guiding philosophy and belief. And so I think in that particular story, that I'm tracing, that I shared with you, your religion is essential. I mean, part of the reason Joe Moakley, as I mentioned, gets involved, he himself, is because of his religious upbringing, because of the story of Romero and the church women. He later is the lead investigator in the U.S. Congress for the case of the 6 slain Jesuits, along with their housekeeper and her daughter in 1989. And so he's kind of inspired by his religious background and upbringing, but also I think many of the people that were involved in revolutionary movements, they themselves were as well. And so I don't necessarily think that they're being deprived of kind of religious belief or kind of religion writ large. I think they saw things very differently from the government and those perhaps in power in those institutions.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for the question.
Hi, thank you. I'll join everyone else in echoing their thanks for a great talk on an important issue. So in the last year, we've seen a huge change in the attitude of the administration toward Cuba, and particularly suspending TPS for Venezuela and Cuba, right? So Cuba had this special status, and now all of a sudden it doesn't, but it's a big source of donation for the current administration, particularly in Florida. So I guess what I'm asking, big question, is can you just talk a little bit about right now where you see the deportation machine kind of focusing its eye on? Because it felt like for a while it was going in one direction, Venezuelan, Cuban, Haitian, and now I'm just not sure where it is.
Yeah, that's an important point. I mean, for so much of 20th century U.S. history, the latter part of the century at least, Cubans had a kind of special status in which more or less they would be allowed to remain in the country. And this is, I think, the Cold War politics that I described comes into play. That's changed in the 21st century. And I think to your question about kind of the deportation machine's focus or who it's targeting, who officials who are implementing the policies behind it are targeting, I think it's anyone and everyone. I don't see as much of a focus or disproportionate attention given to any one group today. Historically, we can think back to the late 19th century when the federal government takes control over immigration in the United States, in large part because they're concerned about immigration from China and Chinese labor migrants presenting an economic, cultural, racial threat to the country. And that shifted to the Southern and Eastern European immigrants around the turn of the 20th century. And then that focused on Mexicans for much of the 20th century. More recently, in the last quarter century or so, we've seen an uptick of apprehensions and targeting of Central Americans. And now, during the past year, certainly, I think, and really during the last 5 years, perhaps, or 8 years, we've seen people targeted from all different nationalities and parts of the world. And I think that's going to have a tremendous long-term effect on these questions and ideas of belonging. It's going to have a tremendous effect on these ideas of who's an American and who's not. But I also think the point that you're making is essential in that the different mechanisms used to target people, particular groups, can shift quickly in some cases. So it might be, we've seen, as you said, just tremendous attention being given to certain places, certain locales, certain groups of people, and then it shifts. And with the growing resources and the growing immigration enforcement presence in communities across the country and places across the country, I don't think that it's going to slow down necessarily. But yeah, it's. I mean, your guess is as good as mine, perhaps. But I do feel like things particularly related to Cuba have changed tremendously, perhaps just as much as anywhere in the Americas in recent years.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? Yes? This will be the last question.
First of all, I just wanted to say thank you for your talk. I think it's a really important issue, and just the stuff that you have to say is really important as well. I was wondering how we can apply this information to understand the deportation machine in a globalized context. For instance, I was reading an article by The Guardian a couple of days ago. It was from about a month ago, I think, but I read it a few days ago, talking about how the US immigration policies are now being proposed in Europe, and there might be an ICE-style kind of movement in Europe in terms of deportation as well. So I was wondering if you could speak on that.
A really essential question, and one that I don't focus on much in my own work, though there are other scholars that are working on immigration enforcement and comparative perspectives in different contexts. I think certainly what we see when it comes to xenophobia or the ramp up of immigration enforcement and the challenges migrants and refugees, asylum seekers face, that's happening in many places around the world. So on the one hand, it's not just a story of the United States, but I think the United States is particular in the sense that if we go back to the question I began with, what kind of nation is the United States? It's thought of as a nation of immigrants. I guess you could say in my book I'm making a case that it's a deportation nation more than a nation of immigrants, and I think the reality is it's both. I mean, there are a lot of other countries that don't allow people to enter or to stay. They don't grant them a pathway to permanent residency or citizenship. Historically, the United States has done that, whereas others have been more exclusionary. It's in part because we've had tens of millions of people come to this country. We have been a nation of immigrants, that we've also had to figure out a system to decide who's allowed to enter and who's allowed to remain. And so those questions aren't unique to the United States, but I do think the United States is somewhat different than other cases, but more in a question of scale, perhaps, than in kind. So thank you for the thoughtful question.
Thank you.
So that'll be our last question. I want to take a moment to thank Adam for giving us such an insightful and timely topic.